I'm Steve Truchan, and I was born in Gary, Indiana. Still have a business here. My business is not primarily race cars, but I do restore some cars, and have put together probably 250 Offenhauser engines, which are Miller derivatives. And I understand you want to talk about the Gulf Miller cars that are going to be for sale here in a few weeks. And I did restore those cars. Those cars are quite unique as far as what all of Miller's stuff were. Those cars had many novel improvements, I guess you could say. Miller built the two engines for the four-cylinder cars. There were two four-cylinder Gulf cars that had front engines and two rear engine Gulf cars that were 6 cylinders, and we're just going to talk about the four-cylinder ones. I think the two engines were built in about 1933, and they were built by Miller to put in an airplane, but they never made it in an airplane. And so Miller filed bankruptcy in 34 or thereabouts, and somehow he ended up still having the engines. In 1937, Ira Vail, who was a race driver, contacted Miller and said that he had some ideas for these cars, and Miller was going to design these two Gulf Miller cars. And they started construction in 37 with Ira Vail being involved in the arrangement. The two cars were built with these side tube radiators. There was a spine, a cast aluminum spine that came up the front of the car that had tubes for water on the top and tubes for oil on the bottom. There was an oil tank that was connected to the bottom of the spine, and the whole intention was that these side tubes were going to cool the engine. The problem with those side tubes was they leaked and the engines ran hot. So they made a modification to those cars, and they put some conventional radiators on the side of the body, and that didn't work either because there was no water going or no air going over the fins in the radiator. So that the last version was the car with the radiator in the front, which there is at your auction, there is the front radiator, the last version of the car that's for sale, and there's also one with the tubes on the side of the car. Gulf also had some requirements that these engines or these cars ran with Gulf's gasoline. And Gulf's gasoline at the time was 81 octane, which did not allow for very much compression ratio. So I think they were built with about 7-to-1 compression originally. And they tried to run these cars, but they weren't very fast. In spite of all of the fancy things that they had for the time, the engines are all alloy castings. And unlike the other Millers, which had a head and a block that were combined, the cylinder block and the head were one piece, there was two cam housings on the top that were generally separated, and the crankcase was separated in the 91 and 122 and 183 cars. But these cars, the cam housings, the head, the block, and the top half of the crankcase were all one Al-Mag casting, which made the engine pretty unique. The other thing that was unique, which is on the one car with the tubes, is that it used a system to start the car, which was a shotgun shell, like some of the early aircraft used to start that. And it's still on that one car. The car with the radiator never got that.
So I got a switch buried in here. So basically you just flip that on. I listened to it to load up a little bit. You turn the two mags on, open the breech, load the cartridge, basically close it, and that's going to pinch it down in there. When you do that, it sends a pin, electrical pin, down to the middle. It grounds this. As soon as that's in and you're ready to go, you turn your fuel on here, open that, flip the switch up, boom.
The other thing that the car had was unique was a transaxle. It's got independent suspension, kind of cross-leaf springs, and the transaxle was really pretty unique in cars at the time. Today most cars have a transaxle. The other thing that was unique was the brakes, and the brakes look like they have a fin brake drum, but the fin brake drum doesn't turn. It's fixed to the chassis of the car, and inside of that there is a disc that's more like a clutch disc. It's about that big in diameter, and it rotates, and there's a series of a big large piston that pushes against the side of that disc. So it really was one of the first things that had what would have been called a disc brake, except the disc brake didn't have a caliper to squeeze it. It had a clutch plate that pushed on the side. It also had a frame that's exposed. You can see it. It's not like most of the old race cars had a rail frame that was, well, kind of like that. But this car's got a pressed steel frame that's about that tall, and it's curved around the bottom of the car, which gave this frame some more stability. However, these cars never ran, and I think they weren't fast, because even with the radiator, they were still running on this 81 octane gasoline, and all of the cars, like at Indianapolis at the time, were 14:1 to compression, which was a big handicap. Shortly thereafter, World War II started, and so, I mean, there wasn't any racing during World War II, and I don't know how, but Preston Tucker, the guy that created the Tucker cars, got control of the two engines, not the cars, but just the engines, and the engines were sent to Louisiana to a company run by Andrew Higgins that was building landing craft for the military for World War II. And they were going to use those engines as a prototype kind of thing for the landing craft. Somehow that didn't happen, and there was a man that worked for Andrew Higgins. Tucker worked for Andrew Higgins also during the war. But there was a guy from Hammond, Indiana, Arnold Strufy, and Arnold Strufy ended up with those two engines, but they were missing all of the internal parts, the crankshaft, connecting rods, valves, pistons, camshafts, but the external alloy parts, the cam housings, the block and the head and the crankcase and in the bottom of the case were all intact. Arnold Strufy owned a junkyard in Hammond, and my dad knew him, and he brought those engines to my dad in probably like 1962, and asked my dad to finish putting them back together. And I remember going to some shop in Indianapolis back about that time with my father and to look at some parts, but the parts weren't the right parts, so we didn't come back with any parts. And they laid around here for a couple years, I suppose, and then Strufy took them back. And I don't know when Strufy died. It had to be like in the 80s. And they still weren't back together. They were just the external parts of those engines. And when Strufy died, he had a friend, Don Lockwood, who used to come around here as well. And Don Lockwood told his wife that he owned the engines, and so he took control of the engines. And about that time, Chuck Davis Sr., I think he's the second, and the one who owns the cars is the third. And Buck Bodeman got both of whatever was left of the cars. The car with the front radiator, at some point, was the one that Buck Bodeman had, and somewhere along the line it got a different engine in it, and they tried to run it someplace, but I don't know, we didn't know, but I've seen pictures with the engine with the exhaust coming out of the other side. The car that the Davises had, they told me was used as a farm wagon or something, but all of the suspension stuff was all still on there, but the body was gone. The two guys that had the cars wanted to buy the engines from Lockwood, but Lockwood said he didn't want those guys to have the engines. But the engines were for sale for somebody else, but nobody else ever bought the engines. Plus the engines didn't have any internals in them, so they weren't complete. And Lockwood stuck to his guns and lived till 100. And those guys wanted to get the engines. Well, they got them from Lockwood's son, and they took them to they took them to the guy that did the Sesco midget engines in Wisconsin, and he put them back together. Ron Hoddles is the guy that put the engines together.
And built the engine.
That's what Davis told me. And they were just, he never tried to do anything with them. They were just there for years and years. But I knew about them forever. I guess most people did.
But nobody knew what the significance of what it would be.
Well, and nobody knew where the cars were for a long time. So, I mean, there was no reason to really get too shook up about the engines, because the cars would be very, very difficult to reconstruct from nothing. You know, I mean, there were so many replica cars built, but they're relatively easy to do. These two cars, I mean, the brakes, the transmission, the engines, everything on it would be just real hard to come up with. I mean, there isn't anything on another car, any place, that would fit this car.
Which is neat. That's
what
makes them so special.
That's why they're still talking about them,
right.
I guess. But the cars were not restored yet, and the Davises had Junior Dreyer do the body for their car. Guffey's car, which came from Bodeman, had an original body that was all there. The frames and the running gear were all intact. That the engines weren't in the car, and they both of them brought the remains of these pieces over here and said, you know, stick them back together. So I made whatever was missing.
And Guffey's car is considered like one of the most original Miller Golfs, right, in existence.
It is.
It is.
It is. It was, I mean, the body was not painted. It's all hammered out, you know, from, if you looked at the inside of the tail, he didn't even want me to paint the car, but it had been around so much that, you know, he said, well, if you paint it, he said, you're going to hide its originality.
Yeah.
And I said, well, all you have to do is look inside of it. You can see that this is not new. So I didn't try to do anything to hide that car. Essentially, I put the engine back in it. I had to modify the one side panel because the exhaust was put out of the other side of the car, so they cut that side out. So I had to make that grill and whatnot on one side of the car. I also did a little bit of body modifications on the Davis car because the shape of some of the tail and the cowl weren't exactly what it was, but I had the other car here to look at. So
right.
That's something that Junior Dreyer didn't have. He was just looking at pictures. Right, and I did them both at the same time. They were both here, so I could look at, like, if there was a piece missing off of one car that the other car had, well, now I could make that piece so it was exactly the same as the other car. And I don't know what year that was. That was about 3 or 4 years ago or something, I guess. But they were painted and lettered here, and the whole shoot match. And both of the engines, before I put them in the car, I ran them on the dyno. We didn't load the dyno, but we started them and ran them on fuel, and so they were both operational. They had oil pressure, and everything worked. The ignition worked. I think they're a pretty unique piece. It's pretty amazing that they're both in the same auction, I guess. At the end of Miller's run before he went bankrupt, they designed a 220 engine. That there were a few of them built, and under Miller, and he also designed a taller, longer engine that was a 255 cubic inch engine that turned into a 270 about the time that Miller went bankrupt. Those two engines, the 220 and the 270, were acquired by Fred Offenhauser at the bankruptcy, who kept that part of the business going, and those turned into engines that Fred made until 1948, or when he resold it to Meyer and Drake, and Meyer and Drake kept that going until 1980, including the turbocharged aluminum 4-cylinders that ran at Indianapolis from 1930 to 1980 about. So the engines are unique from a typical Offenhauser, Miller, Meyer and Drake engine because of the way that they're constructed. My dad has the first 220 that was made. It's here in a car. That was the first 220 engine that Miller made.
Wow.
I think Miller also designed the front-wheel drive cord assemblies that turned up in the Cord cars. I think you have a historic following of people that would be interested in high-dollar cars. I don't think you sell many Vegas or, I mean, some of the auctioneers have a bunch of like regular
curated collection.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I think, if you're trying to sell something that is very unique, you need to have this clientele that will come and say that, well, I'm going to go to that one because I think they probably have some really neat stuff. I think it would be pretty significant for some collector to have them both. First of all, you have the first version and the last version of the car, which part of the issue of that car always was this radiator situation. The one version does have still operational that breech aircraft starter is still on it.
Too.
Yeah.
Yep.
But again, if something ever happened to the engines, you'd have to start all over with the pattern maker and casting, and the whole shooting match would start from the beginning, because there never were any more. That's what, as far as I know, there was 2 engines, and that's it. That's the whole show.